You have arrived here perhaps carrying a weight that has no name, a heaviness that settles into your bones like winter fog. Perhaps you have been told it is sadness, this thing that moves through you, but you know instinctively that what you feel is something far more ancient, far more complex than the simple word sadness could ever contain. Today we venture into territory that modern medicine has mapped with clinical precision, yet somehow the maps feel incomplete. When I speak of depression, I do not speak merely of feeling blue or having a bad day. No, we are here to examine something that operates like a living system within the human psyche, something that rewrites the very architecture of how we experience reality itself. The word depression has become so commonplace, so domesticated by popular culture, that we have forgotten its true nature. It has been reduced to pharmaceutical advertisements and wellness mantras, stripped of its deeper mysteries. But depression, in its truest form, is not simply the absence of happiness. It is an entire world unto itself, complete with its own gravitational pull, its own laws of physics, its own strange and terrible logic. In my years of study, I have encountered countless souls who walk through life as if moving underwater. They speak of mornings that feel like climbing mountains, of thoughts that circle like vultures, of a fatigue so profound it seems to emanate from their very essence. These are not merely symptoms to be catalogued and medicated away. They are the language of a psyche in profound transformation, speaking in code about something far deeper than surface-level sadness. You see, what we call depression is actually a complex neurobiological storm, a cascade of chemical and electrical events that fundamentally alters how the brain processes experience. But to understand this storm, we must first understand that the brain itself is not a machine. It is an ecosystem, a living constellation of billions of neurons communicating through an intricate dance of chemicals and electrical impulses. Imagine, if you will, a vast city at night. Normally, this city hums with activity, lights flickering in patterns of communication, pathways illuminated by the steady flow of traffic. This is your brain on an ordinary day. Neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine carrying messages between regions, maintaining the delicate balance that allows you to feel, think, and navigate the world. Now imagine that same city during a massive power outage. Not complete darkness, but a dimming, a disruption in the usual patterns. Some neighborhoods go completely dark, while others flicker weakly. The normal flow of traffic becomes chaotic, messages get lost, and the entire system struggles to maintain basic functions. This is depression at the neurobiological level, a disruption in the brain's communication networks that affects everything from mood regulation to memory processing to the ability to experience pleasure. But here lies the first mystery that challenges everything we think we know about sadness versus depression. Recent neuroscience research has revealed that depression is not simply the brain producing too little of the good chemicals. The reality is far more complex and, frankly, more fascinating. Scientists have discovered that depression actually involves neuroinflammation, a process where the brain's immune system becomes activated in ways that alter neural function. This inflammation affects the production and effectiveness of neurotransmitters, but it also does something more profound. It changes the physical structure of neural pathways, particularly in regions responsible for emotional regulation, decision-making, and self-perception. The hippocampus, that ancient seahorse-shaped structure deep within the brain, literally shrinks during prolonged depression. This is not metaphorical shrinking. We can measure it with brain imaging technology. The very hardware of memory and learning becomes compromised, which explains why depression affects not just mood, but cognitive function, creating what researchers call cognitive fog or mental cloudiness. But perhaps even more remarkable is what happens in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for executive function and rational thought. During depression, this area shows decreased activity, while the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, becomes hyperactive. It is as if the wise counselor in your head falls silent while the fearful sentinel begins shouting warnings about dangers that may or may not exist. This neurobiological reality helps explain why someone experiencing depression cannot simply think their way out of it or be cheered up by well-meaning friends. The very machinery of positive thinking has been compromised. It is like asking someone with a broken leg to simply walk it off, except the break is invisible and affects the organ that generates our sense of self and reality. Yet here we encounter another layer of complexity that separates depression from ordinary sadness. Sadness in its pure form is actually adaptive. It serves a biological purpose, signaling loss, encouraging social support, and motivating behavioral changes. Sadness has a clear trigger and generally resolves as we process the loss or disappointment that caused it. Depression, however, operates by different rules entirely. It can emerge without clear external triggers, persist long after any reasonable cause has passed, and resist the normal healing mechanisms that address sadness. Where sadness connects us to what we have lost, depression disconnects us from everything, including ourselves. This disconnection manifests in what psychologists call anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure in activities that were once enjoyable. It is not that depressed individuals choose not to enjoy things. The neurobiological machinery of pleasure and reward has been fundamentally altered. The dopamine pathways that normally signal reward and motivation become dysregulated, creating a state where nothing feels worth pursuing. But depression does something even more insidious than stealing pleasure. It rewrites the narrative of the self. In depression, the brain begins to generate what cognitive scientists call negative cognitive biases. Neutral events are interpreted as negative. Ambiguous social cues are read as rejection, and personal setbacks are attributed to permanent character flaws rather than temporary circumstances. This is not simply pessimistic thinking. Brain imaging studies show that during depression, regions involved in self-referential thinking become hyperactive while areas responsible for cognitive flexibility become suppressed. The depressed brain literally becomes stuck in negative self-focused rumination, like a record player with a broken needle, playing the same painful song over and over. What emerges from this neurobiological chaos is a state that transcends simple sadness and enters the realm of what I call existential alteration. The depressed individual does not simply feel sad about their life, they experience a fundamental shift in how reality itself appears to them. Colours seem muted, time moves differently, the future becomes unimaginable, and the past transforms into a catalogue of regrets and failures. This altered state of consciousness helps explain one of depression's most puzzling features, its resistance to logical intervention. You cannot reason with someone out of depression any more than you can reason with someone out of a fever. The neurobiological storm creates its own logic, its own reality, And from within that reality, the depressed person's thoughts and feelings make perfect sense. Recent advances in neuroscience have revealed that depression involves disruptions in multiple brain networks simultaneously. The default mode network, which is active when we are not focused on external tasks and is involved in self-referential thinking, becomes hyperactive and stuck in negative patterns. Meanwhile, the cognitive control network, responsible for directing attention and regulating emotion, becomes weakened. This creates what researchers describe as a perfect storm of neural dysfunction. The brain becomes locked in negative self-focus while simultaneously losing the ability to shift attention away from that focus. It is like being trapped in a house of mirrors where every reflection shows distorted images of inadequacy and hopelessness, while the doors that might lead to different perspectives remain locked. But perhaps most remarkably, recent research has shown that depression actually changes gene expression through epigenetic mechanisms. The experience of depression literally alters which genes are turned on or off, affecting everything from stress hormone production to inflammatory responses to neuroplasticity. This means that depression is not just a temporary state, but can create lasting changes in how the brain functions. These epigenetic changes help explain why depression tends to be recurrent. Each episode of depression makes the brain more vulnerable to future episodes, not through weakness of character, but through biological priming. The neural pathways of depression become well-worn trails that the brain more easily follows during times of stress or vulnerability. Yet within this apparent darkness lies a profound mystery that challenges our understanding of mental suffering itself. Some researchers have begun to explore whether depression, at least in some cases, might serve an adaptive function that we do not yet fully understand. They point to the fact that mild depression can enhance certain types of problem solving, increase attention to detail, and promote more realistic assessments of challenging situations. This research suggests that what we call depression might sometimes represent the psyche's attempt to force a necessary pause, a biological mechanism that prevents us from continuing patterns of behavior or thought that are ultimately unsustainable. In this view, depression becomes not just pathology, but potentially a form of psychological reorganization, albeit one that often becomes stuck or excessive. The implications of this perspective are profound and troubling. It suggests that the relationship between depression and human consciousness is far more complex than simple disease models would suggest. Perhaps depression, in some cases, represents the psyche's last desperate attempt to signal that something fundamental in how we are living needs to change. This brings us to one of the most challenging questions in modern neuroscience and psychology. If depression involves such profound neurobiological changes, if it literally rewires the brain and alters gene expression, what does this mean for recovery? Can the brain truly heal from depression, or does it simply learn to compensate for permanent alterations? The emerging research on neuroplasticity offers both hope and complexity. The brain retains the ability to form new neural pathways throughout life, and interventions ranging from psychotherapy to medication to lifestyle changes can promote the growth of new neurons and the strengthening of healthier neural networks. But this process is neither quick nor simple, and it requires understanding depression not as a character flaw to be overcome, but as a complex neurobiological condition requiring comprehensive treatment. What becomes clear as we delve deeper into the science of depression is that we are not dealing with simple sadness amplified. We are confronting a fundamental alteration in the basic operating system of human consciousness. Depression changes how we perceive time, process memory, experience our bodies, relate to others, and imagine the future. It is, in the truest sense, an altered state of consciousness that creates its own reality. This understanding demands that we approach depression with the respect and complexity it deserves. It is not a weakness to be ashamed of, nor is it simply a chemical imbalance to be quickly corrected. It is a profound disruption in the most complex system known to science, the human brain, and it affects the very core of what makes us human, our conscious experience of being alive. As we continue to unravel the mysteries of depression, we find ourselves confronting fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness itself. What does it mean that our sense of self, our experience of reality, our capacity for joy and connection can be so profoundly altered by changes in neurochemistry and structure? And what does this tell us about the relationship between brain and mind, between biology and experience, between the scientific and the deeply personal dimensions of human suffering? These questions will guide us as we venture deeper into understanding not just what depression is, but what it reveals about the magnificent and fragile nature of human consciousness itself. The questions we have raised lead us into territory that modern science approaches with both precision and humility. For as we map the neural landscapes of depression, we discover that each individual brain tells a unique story of how this condition manifests and evolves. What we are witnessing is not a single disease, but rather a constellation of related phenomena, each expressing itself through the particular architecture of a specific human consciousness. Consider this remarkable finding from recent longitudinal studies. Depression does not affect all brains in identical ways. Some individuals show primarily limbic system disruption, with the emotional centers of the brain becoming hyperactive, while cognitive regions remain relatively intact. Others display predominantly prefrontal dysfunction, where rational thought processes become compromised, while emotional responses may seem oddly muted. Still others experience what researchers call mixed presentations, where multiple brain networks are disrupted simultaneously in patterns that seem almost chaotic. This neurobiological diversity helps explain why depression can manifest so differently from person to person. One individual may experience crushing emotional pain while maintaining intellectual clarity. Another may find their thinking clouded and confused while feeling emotionally numb. A third may cycle between periods of intense agitation and profound emptiness. These are not different severities of the same condition, but rather different expressions of how depression can colonize human consciousness. But there is something even more mysterious at work here, something that challenges our neat categories and clinical definitions. Recent research using advanced brain imaging techniques has revealed that depression appears to create what neuroscientists call neural signatures, unique patterns of brain activity that are as individual as fingerprints. These signatures suggest that depression is not simply disrupting normal brain function, but is actually creating entirely new patterns of neural organization. Think of it this way. Imagine a river that has flowed in the same channel for thousands of years. During a massive flood, the water carves new channels, creating a completely different landscape. When the flood recedes, the river does not simply return to its old path. It now flows through terrain that has been permanently altered. This is what depression does to the brain. It creates new neural territories that did not exist before. These newly carved neural pathways help explain one of depression's most troubling characteristics: its tendency to become self-perpetuating. The brain, in its remarkable adaptability, begins to treat these depression-altered states as normal. Neural networks that were initially disrupted by the condition begin to stabilize in their altered configurations. What started as a disruption becomes a new form of neural organization, complete with its own internal logic and self-reinforcing patterns. This is why someone emerging from a depressive episode often reports feeling like a different person than they were before. They are, in a very real neurobiological sense, different. Their brain has been restructured by the experience of depression, creating new neural territories that will influence how they process emotions, memories, and perceptions for years to come. Yet within this apparent permanence lies a profound paradox that researchers are only beginning to understand. While depression creates lasting changes in brain structure and function, it also appears to enhance certain forms of neuroplasticity in unexpected ways. The same neurobiological processes that make the brain vulnerable to depression's alterations also seem to increase its capacity for healing and reorganization under the right conditions. Scientists have discovered that during depression, the brain produces increased levels of certain proteins associated with neural growth and repair. It is as if the brain, even while being damaged by the depressive process, is simultaneously preparing for its own recovery. This suggests that depression may not be purely destructive, but may also involve the brain's attempt to reorganize itself in response to some deeper dysfunction or environmental challenge. This brings us to one of the most profound mysteries in contemporary neuroscience: the relationship between depression and what researchers call neural criticality. The healthy brain operates at what physicists would recognize as a critical point, a delicate balance between order and chaos that allows for maximum flexibility and responsiveness. Depression appears to push the brain away from this critical point, but the direction of that push varies dramatically between individuals. Some depressed brains become too ordered, locked into rigid patterns of negative thinking and emotional numbness. Others become too chaotic, overwhelmed by emotional storms and cognitive confusion. But a few seem to find a different kind of balance altogether, one that, while painful, may actually enhance certain cognitive and emotional capacities. These individuals often report periods of intense creativity, heightened empathy, or profound philosophical insight emerging from their darkest moments. This phenomenon has led some researchers to propose what they call the depression paradox. Could it be that depression in some cases represents not just pathology, but also a form of neural exploration, the brain's attempt to discover new ways of processing reality when existing patterns have become inadequate? This is not to romanticize depression or suggest that suffering is beneficial, but rather to acknowledge that the relationship between neural dysfunction and human experience is far more complex than simple disease models suggest. The implications of this complexity become even more profound when we consider recent discoveries about the role of the gut microbiome in depression. Scientists have found that the trillions of bacteria living in our digestive systems communicate directly with the brain through what researchers call the gut-brain axis. Changes in these microbial communities can influence neurotransmitter production, inflammatory responses, and even gene expression in ways that significantly impact mood and cognition. This means that depression is not confined to the brain alone, but involves the entire body as an interconnected system. The bacterial communities in our gut, the inflammatory responses in our immune system, the hormonal cascades of our endocrine system, all of these participate in the complex symphony of depression. We are dealing not with a brain disease but with a whole body phenomenon that expresses itself through consciousness. These discoveries force us to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of selfhood itself. If our thoughts, emotions, and perceptions can be so profoundly influenced by bacterial communities in our gut, by inflammatory processes we cannot consciously control, by genetic switches that respond to environmental stresses we may not even recognize, then what does it mean to be an autonomous self? Depression strips away the illusion of mental sovereignty and reveals the profound interconnectedness of mind, body, and environment. This interconnectedness becomes even more apparent when we examine how depression affects what neuroscientists call interoception, our ability to perceive internal bodily signals. Depressed individuals often show altered interoceptive processing, meaning they have difficulty accurately reading their own bodily states. Hunger may not feel like hunger, fatigue may not register as fatigue, and emotional arousal may be disconnected from its physical sensations. This disruption in body awareness creates a cascade of difficulties that extend far beyond mood regulation. Decision-making becomes impaired because we rely on subtle bodily signals to guide our choices. Social connections suffer because we cannot accurately read our own emotional responses to others. Even basic self-care becomes challenging when the internal compass that normally guides our behavior becomes unreliable. Yet perhaps most significantly, disrupted interoception affects what researchers call autobiographical consciousness, our sense of being a continuous self moving through time. This aspect of consciousness depends heavily on the integration of memory, bodily sensation, and emotional experience. When depression disrupts these integrative processes, individuals often report feeling disconnected from their own life story, as if they are observing their existence from a distance rather than fully inhabiting it. This brings us to one of the most unsettling aspects of depression: its effect on temporal perception. Time itself becomes distorted during depressive episodes. Minutes can feel like hours, while months can pass in what seems like moments. The future becomes unimaginable, not because nothing good will ever happen, but because the neural mechanisms that allow us to project ourselves into imagined futures become compromised. Recent studies using neuroimaging have shown that depression specifically affects brain networks involved in what researchers call mental time travel, our ability to remember the past and imagine the future. During depression, these networks become disconnected from each other and from the regions that process current experience. The result is a kind of temporal imprisonment where consciousness becomes trapped in an eternal painful present. This temporal distortion helps explain why depression feels so hopeless to those experiencing it. Hope, in its neurobiological sense, depends on the brain's ability to generate positive future scenarios and connect them to present actions. When the neural machinery of future imagination becomes impaired, hope becomes literally inconceivable. The depressed individual is not choosing to be pessimistic about the future. Their brain has temporarily lost the capacity to construct hopeful futures. But there is something even more profound happening here that touches on fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Depression appears to alter what philosophers call the stream of consciousness, the continuous flow of thoughts, sensations, and experiences that constitute our subjective reality. In depression, this stream becomes turbulent, filled with eddies and whirlpools that trap consciousness in repetitive patterns. These patterns manifest as what clinicians call rumination, the tendency to repeatedly focus on negative thoughts and feelings. But neuroimaging studies reveal that rumination is not simply a bad habit or character flaw. It represents a fundamental alteration in how consciousness moves through time. The normal flow of awareness from one moment to the next becomes disrupted, creating psychological whirlpools where thoughts circle endlessly without resolution. This circularity of depressive thinking reflects deeper changes in neural connectivity. The brain networks that normally allow thoughts to flow and transform become rigid and repetitive. It is as if the neural pathways of creativity and flexibility become blocked, forcing consciousness to travel the same dark roads over and over again. Yet within this apparent rigidity lies another paradox that researchers are beginning to explore. Some individuals with depression show enhanced connectivity in certain brain networks, particularly those involved in introspection and self-analysis. This enhanced connectivity may contribute to the profound self-awareness and psychological insight that many depressed individuals report, even as it amplifies their suffering. Could it be that depression, in some cases, represents a heightened form of consciousness, one that perceives aspects of reality that normally remain hidden but at a cost that becomes unbearable? This possibility does not diminish the reality of depression's suffering, but it does suggest that the relationship between neural dysfunction and conscious experience is far more nuanced than simple pathology models suggest. These questions become even more complex when we consider the role of stress in depression's development and maintenance. Chronic stress appears to be both a cause and a consequence of depression, creating what researchers call allostatic load, the cumulative wear and tear on the body and brain from repeated stress responses. Under chronic stress, the brain's stress response systems become dysregulated. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, begins to be produced in abnormal patterns that can damage the very brain regions responsible for stress regulation. This creates a vicious cycle where stress promotes depression and depression increases vulnerability to stress. But the relationship between stress and depression reveals something profound about human consciousness and its relationship to environment. We are not separate from our surroundings, but are continuously shaped by them at the most fundamental neurobiological level. Social isolation, economic uncertainty, environmental toxins, cultural pressures, all of these external factors can literally rewire our brains and alter our conscious experience. This understanding forces us to reconsider depression not just as an individual medical condition, but as a phenomenon that emerges from the interaction between vulnerable individuals and challenging environments. Some researchers now speak of depression as a social disease, one that reflects not just individual pathology, but collective dysfunction in how we structure our communities and societies. The implications of this perspective are both troubling and liberating. Troubling because they suggest that depression may be, in part, a rational response to genuinely distressing circumstances. Liberating because they point toward interventions that go beyond individual treatment to address the environmental and social factors that contribute to depressive suffering. As we delve deeper into these mysteries, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend far beyond medical science into philosophy, sociology, and even spirituality. What does it mean to be human in a world that can fundamentally alter our consciousness through mechanisms we are only beginning to understand? How do we maintain a sense of authentic selfhood when we know that our thoughts and feelings can be so profoundly influenced by factors beyond our conscious control? These questions will guide us as we continue to explore not just the science of depression, but its deeper implications for how we understand consciousness, identity, and the human condition itself. These profound questions about consciousness and identity become even more complex when we examine what happens to the self during depression. Not the psychological self that we construct through stories and memories, but something deeper, what neuroscientists are beginning to call the minimal self, the basic sense of being a unified experiencing entity moving through time. During depression, this fundamental sense of selfhood becomes fragmented. Individuals often report feeling like strangers to themselves, as if they are watching their life unfold from behind glass. This is not metaphorical language, but describes a literal alteration in the neural processes that create our sense of being an integrated self. The brain regions responsible for self-monitoring and self-awareness begin to operate in isolation from each other, creating what researchers describe as dissociative fragments within consciousness itself. This fragmentation manifests in ways that challenge our basic assumptions about mental coherence. A person might intellectually understand that they are loved while simultaneously feeling utterly abandoned. They might recognize their accomplishments while experiencing themselves as complete failures. These are not contradictions in logic, but reflections of how depression fractures the normally integrated processes of self-perception. What emerges from this fragmentation is something that goes beyond sadness into territory that feels almost otherworldly. Individuals describe states of consciousness that seem to exist outside normal human experience, a kind of psychological limbo where familiar emotions become alien and basic human connections feel impossible. It is as if depression creates its own dimensional space within consciousness, complete with altered physics of time, causation, and meaning. Recent research using sophisticated brain imaging techniques has revealed that during severe depressive episodes, certain brain networks actually begin to operate as if they belong to different people. The neural signature associated with self-recognition becomes inconsistent and fragmented. Parts of the brain that normally collaborate in creating a unified sense of self begin to work at cross purposes, generating internal conflicts that feel like battles between different versions of oneself. This internal warfare helps explain why depression often involves such profound ambivalence. The depressed individual simultaneously wants to connect with others and withdraw from them, craves relief from pain while somehow clinging to familiar suffering, desires change while feeling paralyzed by the prospect of it. These are not character flaws or failures of willpower, but reflections of a consciousness at war with itself at the most fundamental neurobiological level. But there is something even more unsettling happening within the landscape of depressed consciousness. The normal boundaries between self and other, between internal experience and external reality, begin to blur in ways that challenge our understanding of psychological boundaries. Depressed individuals often report feeling overwhelmed by the emotions of others, as if their psychological skin has become permeable. They describe absorbing the moods of rooms, feeling responsible for the emotional states of everyone around them, experiencing the world's suffering as if it were their own. This phenomenon points to alterations in what neuroscientists call self-other distinction, the brain's ability to differentiate between internally generated experiences and those that originate from external sources. During depression, the neural mechanisms that normally maintain these boundaries become compromised, creating a kind of psychological porosity that can be both overwhelming and oddly illuminating. Some individuals report that this blurring of boundaries, while distressing, also provides access to forms of empathy and understanding that were previously unavailable to them. They describe feeling connected to universal patterns of suffering and healing, as if depression had somehow stripped away the psychological barriers that normally separate individual consciousness from collective human experience. This brings us to one of the most paradoxical aspects of depression, its relationship to insight and wisdom. While depression clearly impairs many cognitive functions, it appears to enhance others in ways that researchers are only beginning to understand. Depressed individuals often show increased accuracy in assessing social situations, enhanced ability to detect deception, and greater realism about their own capabilities and limitations. This phenomenon, known as depressive realism, suggests that depression may involve a kind of brutal honesty about aspects of life that most people prefer to ignore or minimize. The normal cognitive biases that help maintain psychological well-being, the tendency to overestimate our control over events, to maintain unrealistic optimism about the future, to filter out negative information, become diminished during depression. While this enhanced realism contributes to depression's suffering, it also raises profound questions about the relationship between accurate perception and psychological health. Are the cognitive biases that protect us from depression also preventing us from seeing important truths about ourselves and our world? Does mental health require a certain amount of self-deception? And if so, what does this tell us about the nature of human consciousness? These questions become even more complex when we consider recent discoveries about depression's effects on creativity and artistic expression. Many individuals report that their most profound creative insights emerge during or immediately following depressive episodes. The same neural alterations that create suffering also appear to facilitate access to forms of thinking and perception that are normally unavailable. Brain imaging studies have shown that depression affects the default mode network, the brain system active during rest and introspection, in ways that can enhance certain types of creative problem solving. The normal constraints on associative thinking become loosened, allowing for connections between ideas that would typically remain separate. This may explain why so many artists, writers, and innovators throughout history have struggled with depression while producing their most meaningful work. But this relationship between depression and creativity reveals something disturbing about human consciousness itself. It suggests that our normal, healthy mental states may actually limit our access to certain forms of insight and understanding. The psychological mechanisms that protect us from depression may also constrain our ability to perceive and create in ways that depression, for all its darkness, somehow liberates. This paradox extends beyond individual creativity to encompass broader questions about consciousness and its relationship to truth. Recent studies have found that depressed individuals often show enhanced accuracy in memory recall, particularly for negative events. While healthy individuals tend to remember positive experiences more vividly than negative ones, depressed individuals show more balanced and accurate recollection of both positive and negative experiences. This enhanced memory accuracy, while contributing to depression's persistence, also suggests that depression may involve a kind of cognitive honesty that challenges the normal mechanisms of psychological self-protection. The depressed brain appears to resist the comforting distortions that normally help us maintain optimism and self-esteem, insisting instead on a more complete and often painful accuracy about the nature of experience. Yet within this insistence on truth lies another layer of complexity that researchers are beginning to explore. While depression enhances accuracy about certain aspects of reality, it also creates profound distortions in others. The same individual who shows remarkable insight into social dynamics may simultaneously hold completely unrealistic beliefs about their own worthlessness. The brain that accurately remembers negative events may lose the ability to recall positive ones with equivalent clarity. This selective accuracy suggests that depression does not simply remove the filters of healthy cognition, but replaces them with different filters that emphasize certain aspects of reality while obscuring others. The result is not clearer vision, but rather a different kind of blindness, one that sees suffering with crystal clarity while becoming unable to perceive hope, beauty, or possibility. These distortions in perception extend to the very structure of time itself within depressed consciousness. While healthy individuals tend to experience time as flowing naturally from past through present toward future, depression creates what researchers call temporal fragmentation. The past becomes a source of endless regret and rumination, the future disappears into unimaginable void, and the present stretches into an eternal, unchanging now of discomfort. This alteration in temporal experience helps explain why depression feels so permanent to those experiencing it. When the neural mechanisms that normally allow us to imagine change and growth become impaired, the current state of suffering appears to be the only reality that has ever existed or ever will exist. The depressed individual is not being dramatic when they say they cannot imagine feeling better. Their brain has temporarily lost the capacity to generate hopeful futures. But there is something even more profound happening here that touches on fundamental questions about the nature of time and consciousness itself. Recent neuroscience research has revealed that our normal experience of time as a flowing river is actually constructed by specific brain networks that integrate memory, attention, and prediction. Depression disrupts these networks in ways that reveal how artificial our normal temporal experience actually is. In depression, individuals often report experiencing what they describe as frozen time or circular time, states where normal temporal flow seems to stop or repeat endlessly. These are not metaphorical descriptions, but reflect actual alterations in the neural processes that create our sense of temporal continuity. The brain systems that normally project consciousness smoothly from one moment to the next become dysregulated, creating temporal experiences that feel alien and disturbing. This disruption of temporal flow has profound implications for how we understand consciousness itself. If our normal sense of time is constructed by brain processes that can be altered by depression, What does this tell us about the nature of reality and our place within it? Are the temporal experiences of depression revealing something about time that our normal consciousness obscures? Or are they simply distortions created by neural dysfunction? These questions become even more complex when we consider recent discoveries about depression's effects on what researchers call episodic future thinking, our ability to imagine specific future scenarios and connect them to present actions. This capacity is crucial not only for planning and decision-making, but for maintaining hope and motivation. During depression, episodic future thinking becomes severely impaired, not because individuals choose to be pessimistic, but because the neural machinery of future imagination becomes compromised. The loss of future imagination creates a kind of psychological imprisonment that goes beyond simple hopelessness. When the brain cannot generate specific positive future scenarios, the very concept of change becomes inconceivable. Individuals find themselves trapped not just in current suffering, but in a consciousness that has lost the ability to conceive of alternatives to that suffering. Yet within this apparent limitation lies another paradox that challenges our understanding of human consciousness. Some individuals with depression report accessing forms of present moment awareness that feel profound and transformative. Unable to escape into fantasies about the future or ruminations about the past, they find themselves forced into an intense immediacy of experience that, while often painful, can also be remarkably clear and direct. This forced presence suggests that depression, for all its distortions, may also strip away certain illusions about time and selfhood that normally structure our experience. The healthy mind's constant movement between past and future, its elaborate constructions of identity and meaning, its comfortable assumptions about continuity and control, all of these become unavailable during depression, leaving consciousness naked and immediate in ways that can be both terrifying and illuminating. These insights point toward questions that extend far beyond medical science into philosophy, spirituality, and the deepest mysteries of human existence. What does it mean that our normal healthy consciousness may actually be constructed from comfortable illusions? How do we understand suffering that simultaneously destroys and reveals, that brings both profound limitation and unexpected insight? As we continue to explore these territories, we find ourselves confronting not just the science of depression, but fundamental questions about what it means to be conscious, to suffer, and to exist as human beings in a reality far stranger and more complex than our everyday experience suggests. These revelations about the fragmented nature of depressed consciousness lead us into even more mysterious territory, where the boundaries between neuroscience and the deepest questions of human existence begin to dissolve. For what we discover as we map the neural landscapes of depression is that consciousness itself may be far more fragile and constructed than we ever imagined. Consider this unsettling finding from recent neuroimaging studies. During severe depressive episodes, the brain begins to exhibit what researchers call network segregation. The various neural systems that normally communicate fluidly with each other become isolated, operating as separate islands of activity within the skull. It is as if the great orchestra of consciousness suddenly fragments into individual musicians, each playing their own song with no conductor to unify the performance. This segregation manifests in ways that challenge everything we think we know about mental unity. An individual might experience profound emotional pain while their cognitive systems register this pain as if it belonged to someone else. They might understand intellectually that they have reasons to live while simultaneously planning their death with meticulous detail. These are not contradictions in reasoning, but reflections of a consciousness that has literally split into competing fragments. What emerges from this neural fragmentation is something that goes beyond ordinary human experience into territory that feels almost archetypal in its strangeness. Individuals describe encountering aspects of themselves that seem foreign and autonomous, as if depression had awakened dormant personalities within the psyche. They speak of inner voices that comment continuously on their inadequacy, of shadow selves that emerge to sabotage any movement toward healing, of witnessing their own thoughts as if they were watching a disturbing film. This multiplication of self within depressed consciousness points towards something profound about the nature of identity itself. What we normally experience as a unified self may actually be a temporary coalition of neural processes that depression reveals to be far more fragmented and conditional than we ever suspected. The I that thinks, the I that feels, the I that remembers, the I that plans. These may be separate functions that normally collaborate so seamlessly we mistake them for a single entity. But there is something even more unsettling happening within this fragmented landscape. Recent research has revealed that depression appears to activate what neuroscientists call phylogenetically ancient brain systems, neural networks that evolved millions of years ago and normally remain dormant beneath the more recent developments of human consciousness. It is as if depression strips away the newer layers of human neural evolution, exposing older, more primitive forms of awareness. These ancient systems operate according to different rules than our familiar conscious mind. They process threat and safety, dominance and submission, attachment and abandonment in ways that feel alien to our normal psychological experience. When depression activates these systems, individuals often report feeling as if they have been possessed by something non-human, some evolutionary ghost that sees the world through eyes shaped by survival pressures that no longer exist. This activation of ancestral neural patterns helps explain why depression often involves such profound feelings of existential threat. The ancient brain systems that depression awakens do not distinguish between physical and psychological danger. Social rejection registers as life-threatening abandonment, criticism feels like predatory attack, and failure triggers responses appropriate to facing extinction. The depressed individual is not being overly dramatic. They are literally experiencing modern psychological challenges through neural systems designed for far more primitive forms of survival. Yet within this apparent regression lies another paradox that researchers are beginning to explore. Some individuals report that depression, for all its activation of ancient fears, also provides access to forms of intuitive wisdom that feel equally ancient and profound. They describe suddenly understanding patterns in human behavior that were previously invisible, sensing the hidden emotional currents that flow beneath social interactions, feeling connected to something vast and impersonal that transcends individual identity. This suggests that depression may not simply activate primitive fear responses, but may also awaken older forms of consciousness that our modern minds have forgotten how to access. The same neural archaeology that exposes ancient terrors may also uncover ancient wisdoms, forms of knowing that predate language and logic but carry their own forms of truth. These discoveries force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between evolution and consciousness. If depression can activate neural systems that evolved millions of years ago, what does this tell us about the stability of human consciousness itself? Are we as far removed from our evolutionary past as we imagine, or does depression reveal that ancient forms of awareness continue to shape our experience in ways we rarely recognize? The implications become even more profound when we consider recent findings about depression's effects on what researchers call social brain networks. The neural systems responsible for understanding others, predicting their behavior, and navigating complex social relationships. During depression, these networks undergo dramatic reorganization that fundamentally alters how individuals perceive and respond to social cues. Depressed individuals often report feeling as if they can see through social pretenses with startling clarity. They describe detecting hidden resentments, unspoken disappointments, and concealed judgments that others seem oblivious to. This enhanced social perception, while often accurate, becomes a source of profound isolation as they begin to see the gap between what people say and what they actually feel or think. Brain imaging studies have confirmed that depression does indeed enhance activity in neural regions associated with social threat detection while suppressing areas involved in social reward processing. The result is a kind of social radar that becomes hypersensitive to signs of rejection, criticism, or abandonment, while becoming blind to signals of acceptance, appreciation, or love. This altered social perception creates a vicious cycle where accurate detection of negative social cues becomes self-fulfilling prophecy. The depressed individual's enhanced sensitivity to social threat leads them to withdraw or behave defensively, which in turn generates the very rejection and criticism they feared. They become trapped in a social reality that their altered neural processing has helped create. But there is something even more disturbing happening here that touches on fundamental questions about the nature of social reality itself. If depression enhances our ability to detect genuine social threats while blinding us to social rewards, what does this tell us about the authentic nature of human relationships? Are the positive social connections that healthy individuals experience genuine, or are they maintained through a kind of necessary social blindness that depression cruelly strips away? These questions become even more complex when we consider recent discoveries about depression's effects on mirror neuron systems, the neural networks that allow us to unconsciously mimic and empathize with others. During depression, these systems become dysregulated in ways that create profound distortions in empathic processing. Some depressed individuals experience what researchers call empathic overwhelm, where the boundaries between self and other become so permeable that they absorb the emotional states of everyone around them. They describe walking into rooms and immediately feeling flooded by the unspoken anxieties, disappointments, and conflicts of others, as if their psychological skin had become transparent. Others experience the opposite phenomenon, a kind of empathic numbness where they can intellectually understand that others are suffering but cannot access the emotional resonance that normally accompanies such understanding. They watch loved ones in pain and feel nothing, which generates additional guilt and self-condemnation that deepens their depression. Both forms of empathic distortion point toward alterations in the fundamental mechanisms through which consciousness connects with other consciousness. Depression appears to disrupt the delicate neural processes that normally allow us to feel with others while maintaining our own psychological boundaries. The result is either a kind of psychic drowning in others' emotions or a desert-like isolation from all emotional connection. This disruption of empathic processing reveals something profound about the social nature of consciousness itself. What we experience as individual awareness may actually depend on subtle forms of neural synchronization with the consciousness of others. Depression may disrupt these synchronization processes, creating forms of psychological isolation that go far deeper than simple loneliness. Recent research using advanced brain imaging techniques has revealed that healthy individuals show neural synchronization with others during social interactions. Their brains literally begin to mirror the activity patterns of those they are connecting with. During depression, this neural mirroring becomes severely impaired, creating a kind of consciousness that operates in isolation from the collective neural symphony that normally surrounds us. This isolation from collective consciousness may help explain why depression feels so alien and otherworldly to those experiencing it. They are not simply sad or disappointed, they have become disconnected from the fundamental neural processes through which human consciousness normally participates in shared reality. They find themselves in a kind of psychological exile, cut off from the subtle neural conversations that usually bind individual awareness into the larger fabric of human experience. Yet within this apparent disconnection lies another mystery that challenges our understanding of individual versus collective consciousness. Some individuals report that depression, while isolating them from ordinary social connection, also provides access to forms of universal awareness that transcend personal identity. They describe feeling connected to patterns of suffering and healing that extend far beyond their individual experience, as if depression had somehow tuned their consciousness to frequencies of collective human experience that are normally inaudible. This phenomenon suggests that consciousness may operate on multiple levels simultaneously: individual, interpersonal, and transpersonal, and that depression may disrupt some of these levels while potentially enhancing others. The same neural alterations that create isolation from immediate social connection may open channels to broader forms of awareness that healthy consciousness normally filters out. These discoveries about the social dimensions of depressed consciousness lead us into territory where neuroscience begins to merge with questions that have traditionally belonged to philosophy and spirituality. If our individual consciousness is normally sustained through subtle neural connections with others, what does this tell us about the nature of selfhood? Are we truly separate beings, or are we more like temporary nodes in a vast network of interconnected awareness? Depression forces these usually theoretical questions to become intensely practical and immediate. When the neural processes that normally maintain our sense of connected selfhood become disrupted, individuals must confront the possibility that their identity was always more fragile and interdependent than they realized. The self that seemed so solid and autonomous reveals itself to be a kind of collaborative fiction that depression exposes and dismantles. This dismantling of constructed selfhood, while terrifying, also opens possibilities for forms of identity and awareness that transcend ordinary psychological categories. Some individuals report that depression, by destroying their familiar sense of self, also liberated them from limiting beliefs and assumptions about who they were supposed to be. The psychological death that depression brings can become a kind of rebirth into more authentic forms of existence. But this potential for transformation comes at an enormous cost, and the journey through depression's dark territories offers no guarantees of positive outcome. Many individuals become lost in the fragmented landscapes of depressed consciousness, unable to find their way back to functional forms of identity and connection. The line between transformative dissolution and destructive disintegration remains dangerously thin. These considerations bring us to one of the most challenging aspects of understanding depression: its relationship to what researchers call narrative coherence, our ability to construct meaningful stories about our lives that connect past, present, and future into comprehensible wholes. Depression appears to attack the very foundations of narrative coherence, leaving individuals unable to construct meaningful accounts of their existence. Without coherent life narratives, individuals lose not only their sense of purpose and direction, but their basic sense of existing as continuous beings moving through time. They find themselves trapped in disconnected moments of experience, unable to weave these moments into stories that provide meaning and motivation. The past becomes a collection of painful fragments. The present feels arbitrary and meaningless, and the future disappears entirely. This destruction of narrative coherence may be one of depression's most devastating effects, as human consciousness appears to depend heavily on our ability to construct meaningful stories about our experience. When these story-making capacities become impaired, individuals lose not only hope, but the very framework through which hope could be conceived or experienced. Yet even this apparent destruction of meaning-making capacity reveals something profound about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to story and meaning. Perhaps the narratives we normally construct about our lives, while psychologically necessary, also limit our access to forms of experience and awareness that exist beyond the boundaries of personal story. As we continue to explore these deepest territories of depressed consciousness, we find ourselves confronting questions that extend far beyond medical science into the fundamental mysteries of what it means to be human, to suffer, and to exist as conscious beings in a reality far stranger and more complex than our everyday experience suggests. These profound disruptions in narrative coherence point us toward an even deeper mystery that challenges everything we thought we understood about the relationship between mind and reality. For what recent neuroscience has revealed is that depression does not simply alter how we feel about our lives, it fundamentally rewrites the basic operating system through which consciousness constructs experience itself. Consider this startling discovery from advanced neuroimaging studies. During depressive episodes, the brain begins to exhibit what researchers call default mode hyperconnectivity, a state where the networks responsible for self-referential thinking become pathologically overactive while simultaneously becoming disconnected from reality testing mechanisms. It is as if the mind becomes trapped in an echo chamber of its own making, generating increasingly distorted reflections of selfhood that bear less and less resemblance to actual experience. This hyperconnectivity manifests in ways that reveal the constructed nature of our normal sense of reality. Individuals report experiencing what they describe as thought loops, endless cycles of self-critical analysis that seem to operate independently of conscious control. These are not simply negative thoughts, but autonomous mental processes that appear to have developed their own momentum and logic, like psychological tornadoes that consume everything in their path. Brain imaging reveals that these thought loops correspond to actual changes in neural connectivity patterns. The regions responsible for self-monitoring become hyperlinked to memory centers in ways that create compulsive searching through past experiences for evidence of personal inadequacy. It is as if the brain has become a detective investigating its own failures, but a detective whose methods guarantee that only incriminating evidence will be found. What emerges from this neural reorganization is something that transcends ordinary psychological categories and enters territory that feels almost metaphysical in its strangeness. Individuals describe states of consciousness where they seem to exist simultaneously in multiple temporal dimensions, reliving past humiliations with the vividness of present experience, while projecting these failures into imagined futures with mathematical precision. Time becomes not a river, but a prison where past, present, and future collapse into a single, eternal moment of suffering. This temporal collapse reflects deeper alterations in what neuroscientists call episodic memory processing. The brain's ability to encode and retrieve specific experiences within their proper temporal and contextual frameworks. During depression, these processes become severely dysregulated, creating what researchers describe as memory intrusions, where past experiences invade present consciousness with the immediacy and emotional intensity of current events. But there is something even more unsettling happening within this disrupted temporal landscape. Recent studies have revealed that depression appears to alter the fundamental mechanisms through which consciousness creates continuity of experience. The neural processes that normally weave individual moments into coherent streams of awareness become fragmented, creating forms of psychological existence that feel discontinuous and alien. Individuals report experiencing themselves as if they were multiple people living in the same body. A morning self that makes plans and commitments, an afternoon self that feels incapable of honoring them, and an evening self that condemns both predecessors for their failures. These are not metaphorical descriptions, but reflect actual alterations in the neural networks responsible for maintaining psychological continuity across time. This fragmentation of temporal selfhood helps explain why depression often involves such profound feelings of confusion and disorientation. The normal sense of being a consistent person moving through coherent experience dissolves, leaving individuals feeling like strangers to themselves, unable to recognize their own thoughts and emotions as genuinely belonging to them. Yet within this apparent dissolution of coherent selfhood lies another paradox that researchers are beginning to explore. Some individuals report that depression, by destroying their familiar sense of identity, also liberated them from psychological patterns and assumptions that had been limiting their growth for years. The demolition of constructed selfhood, while terrifying, can also clear space for forms of identity and awareness that were previously impossible. This potential for transformation through destruction points towards something profound about the relationship between psychological breakdown and breakthrough. What we call depression may sometimes represent the psyche's attempt to dismantle outdated forms of selfhood that have become obstacles to authentic existence. The suffering involved is not incidental, but may be an essential part of the process through which consciousness reorganizes itself around deeper truths. These insights force us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of psychological health itself. If our normal, healthy sense of self is constructed from potentially limiting beliefs and assumptions, then what does it mean to be mentally well? Is psychological health simply the successful maintenance of comfortable illusions, or does it require a more fundamental honesty about the nature of selfhood and reality? The implications become even more complex when we consider recent discoveries about depression's effects on what researchers call cognitive flexibility, the brain's ability to shift between different ways of thinking and perceiving. While depression clearly impairs many forms of cognitive flexibility, it appears to enhance others in ways that challenge our understanding of mental dysfunction. Depressed individuals often show increased ability to detect subtle patterns in complex information, enhanced sensitivity to environmental changes, and greater accuracy in assessing ambiguous social situations. They may lose the ability to shift away from negative thinking patterns, but they often gain access to forms of perception and analysis that are normally unavailable to healthy consciousness. This selective enhancement of certain cognitive abilities suggests that depression may not represent simple mental deterioration, but rather a radical reorganization of consciousness around different priorities and ways of processing information. The brain systems that normally filter information to maintain psychological comfort become suppressed, while systems that prioritize accuracy and threat detection become hyperactive. The result is a form of consciousness that sees more clearly in some domains while becoming blind in others. Depressed individuals may perceive social dynamics, environmental dangers, and personal limitations with startling accuracy, while losing the ability to recognize opportunities, appreciate beauty, or imagine positive possibilities. They become specialists in certain forms of truth while losing access to others. This specialization of consciousness toward particular forms of awareness raises profound questions about the relationship between mental health and accurate perception. If depression enhances our ability to see certain aspects of reality that healthy consciousness filters out, then what are the implications for how we understand psychological treatment? Should the goal be to restore comforting illusions, or to help individuals integrate enhanced perception with renewed capacity for hope and joy? These questions become even more complex when we examine depression's effects on what neuroscientists call interoceptive awareness, our ability to perceive internal bodily signals. Recent research has revealed that depression fundamentally alters how consciousness relates to the physical body, creating forms of embodied experience that feel alien and disturbing. Many depressed individuals report feeling disconnected from their own bodies, as if they were operating remote-controlled vessels rather than inhabiting living flesh. Physical sensations become muted or distorted, hunger and fatigue register weakly or not at all, and the normal pleasure of embodied existence disappears. It is as if consciousness has become partially severed from its biological foundation, creating a ghostly form of existence that feels neither fully alive nor completely dead. But other individuals experience the opposite phenomenon, a kind of hyper-embodiment where every physical sensation becomes overwhelming and painful. They describe feeling trapped within bodies that seem to broadcast distress signals constantly, where normal bodily functions like breathing and heartbeat become sources of anxiety rather than unconscious comfort. Both forms of altered embodiment point toward disruptions in the fundamental processes through which consciousness integrates with biological existence. The seamless unity of mind and body that characterizes healthy experience becomes fractured, creating forms of selfhood that feel incomplete and unsustainable. These alterations in embodied consciousness reveal something profound about the relationship between awareness and physical existence. What we normally experience as unified mind-body consciousness may actually depend on complex neural processes that depression disrupts. When these processes become impaired, individuals discover that the unity of psychological and physical existence was always more fragile and constructed than they realized. This discovery has profound implications for how we understand the nature of consciousness itself. If awareness can become partially disconnected from bodily existence, what does this tell us about the relationship between mind and brain? Are we truly biological beings whose consciousness emerges from neural activity, or are we something more complex that temporarily inhabits biological form? Depression forces these usually theoretical questions to become immediate and practical concerns. When the normal integration of consciousness and embodiment becomes disrupted, individuals must confront fundamental questions about what they actually are and how they relate to physical reality. These confrontations with the nature of embodied existence often extend into the realm of what researchers call existential symptoms, forms of suffering that go beyond psychological distress into questions about the meaning and purpose of existence itself. Depressed individuals frequently report feeling as if they have awakened from a dream of meaning into a reality that appears arbitrary and purposeless. This existential awakening, while painful, may also represent a form of philosophical maturation that healthy consciousness normally avoids. Depression strips away the comfortable assumptions and convenient meanings that usually structure human experience, leaving individuals face to face with fundamental questions about why anything exists at all. Some philosophers and researchers have suggested that this confrontation with existential meaninglessness may be an essential part of human development that modern life usually allows us to avoid. Depression, in this view, becomes not just pathology, but a forced encounter with aspects of existence that are normally kept at bay through distraction, achievement, and social connection. The implications of this perspective are both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because they suggest that the meaning and purpose we normally experience may be largely constructed rather than inherent. Liberating because they point toward possibilities for creating more authentic forms of meaning that can withstand the scrutiny of existential analysis. This brings us to one of the most paradoxical aspects of depression, its relationship to what researchers call post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where individuals emerge from severely challenging experiences with enhanced psychological resources, deeper wisdom, and more authentic forms of identity. While depression clearly involves enormous suffering, it may also create conditions for forms of psychological development that would otherwise remain impossible. The same neural plasticity that allows depression to reshape consciousness in destructive ways also creates opportunities for reconstruction along different lines. Individuals who successfully navigate through depressive episodes often report emerging with greater emotional resilience, enhanced empathy, clearer priorities and more authentic relationships than they possessed before their suffering began. This potential for growth through destruction reflects something profound about the nature of consciousness itself. Like forests that require periodic fires to clear undergrowth and allow new growth, human awareness may sometimes need to be stripped down to its foundations before it can reorganize around deeper truths and more sustainable patterns. But this potential for transformation comes with no guarantees, and the journey through depression's territories offers no promise of positive outcome. Many individuals become lost in the fragmented landscapes of depressed consciousness, unable to find pathways back to functional forms of existence. The line between constructive dissolution and destructive disintegration remains perilously thin. These considerations lead us toward questions that extend far beyond individual psychology into collective and cultural dimensions of human existence. If depression represents, in part, a response to genuinely problematic aspects of modern life, then what does this tell us about the societies and cultures within which depressive suffering emerges? Recent epidemiological studies have revealed that depression rates vary dramatically across different cultures and historical periods, suggesting that this condition may reflect not just individual vulnerability, but collective dysfunction in how human communities organize themselves. The same social and environmental factors that promote individual psychological distress may also create conditions where depressive suffering becomes endemic rather than exceptional. This perspective suggests that understanding depression requires examining not just individual brains, but the larger context within which those brains develop and function. The neural alterations that create depressive suffering may represent in part adaptations to environments that are themselves dysfunctional in ways that healthy human consciousness cannot easily tolerate. If this is true, then treating depression may require not just individual interventions, but collective changes in how we structure our communities, economies, and cultures. The suffering of depressed individuals may be signaling problems that extend far beyond personal pathology into the foundations of how we organize human society itself. These insights point toward forms of understanding and intervention that integrate individual healing with collective transformation. They suggest that the mysteries of depression cannot be fully solved through neuroscience alone, but require wisdom that encompasses psychology, sociology, ecology, and perhaps even spirituality. As we continue to explore these deepest territories of human suffering and potential transformation, we find ourselves confronting questions that challenge everything we thought we knew about consciousness, identity, meaning, and the nature of human existence itself. The science of depression reveals not just the mechanics of mental suffering, but fundamental mysteries about what it means to be conscious beings struggling to create meaning and connection in a reality far stranger and more complex than our everyday experience suggests. These revelations about the collective dimensions of depression lead us into territory where individual suffering becomes inseparable from larger patterns of human existence that we rarely acknowledge or examine. For what emerges as we deepen our understanding is that depression may not be simply a disorder of individual brains, but a phenomenon that reveals fundamental tensions between human consciousness and the environments we have created for ourselves. Recent longitudinal studies tracking depression across multiple generations have uncovered something both fascinating and disturbing. The neural signatures of depression appear to be changing over time. The brain patterns associated with depressive episodes in individuals born in the 1950s differ significantly from those found in people born in the 1990s. It is as if depression itself is evolving, adapting to new forms of environmental stress and cultural pressure that previous generations never encountered. This evolutionary aspect of depression challenges our basic assumptions about mental illness as a fixed biological phenomenon. Instead, we may be witnessing a dynamic process where human consciousness continuously adapts to changing environmental conditions, sometimes in ways that create new forms of suffering. The depression experienced by someone raised in the digital age involves neural alterations that reflect exposure to information overload, social media comparison, and technological isolation in ways that would have been impossible for earlier generations. But there is something even more profound happening here that touches on fundamental questions about the relationship between consciousness and culture. Recent neuroimaging studies have revealed that the brains of individuals living in different cultural contexts show distinct patterns of neural organization, even when controlling for genetic factors. The way we think, feel, and perceive reality is literally shaped by the cultural environments within which our consciousness develops. This cultural shaping of neural architecture means that depression cannot be understood apart from the specific historical and social contexts within which it emerges. The depression experienced by someone living in a highly individualistic culture differs fundamentally from that experienced by someone raised in a more collectivist society. The neural networks involved, the symptoms expressed, and even the possibilities for healing vary dramatically based on cultural programming that begins before conscious memory. These discoveries force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between individual mental health and collective cultural health. If our brains are continuously shaped by cultural inputs, then widespread depression may signal something problematic about the cultural environments themselves rather than simply reflecting individual pathology. The suffering of depressed individuals becomes a kind of cultural symptom, revealing tensions and contradictions within the larger systems of meaning and organization that structure human society. This perspective helps explain why depression rates have increased so dramatically in recent decades, particularly in developed nations with high levels of technological advancement and economic prosperity. The same cultural conditions that have created unprecedented material comfort and technological capability may also be generating forms of psychological stress that human consciousness struggles to process and integrate. Consider the paradox of what researchers call digital nativity, the phenomenon of growing up immersed in digital technologies that fundamentally alter how consciousness develops and functions. Individuals raised with constant access to digital stimulation show different patterns of attention, different capacity for sustained focus, and different forms of social connection than previous generations. Their brains have literally been rewired by technological environments that did not exist until very recently in human history. While these technological adaptations provide certain advantages, they may also create vulnerabilities that manifest as depression when individuals encounter situations that require forms of attention, patience, and social connection that their digitally adapted brains struggle to provide. The depression of the digital age may reflect in part a mismatch between evolved human consciousness and the technological environments we have created. But this technological dimension of depression reveals something even more unsettling about the nature of human adaptability itself. Our brains appear to be so plastic, so responsive to environmental inputs, that they can be fundamentally reshaped by cultural conditions within a single generation. This extraordinary adaptability, while allowing for rapid cultural evolution, also creates the possibility for forms of neural organization that may not serve long-term human flourishing. The implications extend beyond individual psychology into questions about the direction of human evolution itself. If cultural environments can reshape consciousness so rapidly and dramatically, then we may be witnessing the emergence of new forms of human awareness that differ fundamentally from anything that has existed before. Depression may be one manifestation of the growing pains involved in this rapid neural evolution. These considerations lead us into territory where neuroscience merges with anthropology, sociology, and even philosophy to examine depression as a phenomenon that reveals fundamental tensions within human civilization itself. The same cognitive abilities that allow us to create complex technologies and social systems may also generate forms of psychological stress that our evolutionary heritage leaves us ill-equipped to handle. Recent studies of depression in different economic systems have revealed striking patterns that support this interpretation. Individuals living in highly competitive, individualistic economic environments show different neural signatures of depression than those living in more cooperative, community-oriented systems. The brain literally adapts to different economic pressures, creating forms of consciousness that reflect the values and assumptions embedded in economic structures. This means that depression cannot be separated from questions about how we organize work, distribute resources, and structure social relationships. The neural alterations that create individual suffering may reflect in part adaptations to economic systems that prioritize competition over cooperation, productivity over well-being, and individual achievement over collective flourishing. These insights point toward forms of intervention that go far beyond individual therapy or medication to encompass fundamental questions about how human societies should be organized. If depression reflects, in part, the psychological costs of certain forms of social organization, then healing may require not just individual treatment, but collective transformation of the systems that generate depressive suffering. But such transformation faces enormous obstacles because the same cultural systems that contribute to depression also create powerful vested interests in maintaining existing arrangements. The economic structures that generate psychological stress also concentrate wealth and power in ways that make systemic change extremely difficult to achieve. Depression becomes not just individual suffering, but a form of social control that keeps people too exhausted and demoralized to challenge the conditions that create their distress. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of depression's relationship to social systems, its potential function as what sociologists call social anesthesia. Depressed individuals often become politically passive, socially withdrawn, and focus primarily on individual survival rather than collective action. They may lose the energy and motivation needed to organize for social change, even when they recognize that their suffering has social as well as individual causes. This anesthetizing effect of depression raises profound questions about the relationship between mental health treatment and social justice. If depression partly reflects genuine problems in how society is organized, then should treatment focus on helping individuals adapt to problematic systems or on empowering them to work for systemic change? The answer may determine whether mental health interventions serve to perpetuate or transform the conditions that generate psychological suffering. These questions become even more complex when we consider recent discoveries about what researchers call intergenerational transmission of depression. The neural alterations associated with depression can be passed from parents to children through epigenetic mechanisms that affect gene expression without changing the underlying DNA sequence. This means that the psychological wounds of one generation can literally become encoded in the biology of the next. Intergenerational transmission helps explain why depression often runs in families in ways that cannot be accounted for by genetics alone. A parent's experience of chronic stress, trauma, or depression can alter their gene expression in ways that affect their children's neural development, creating vulnerabilities that may not manifest until decades later. The suffering of previous generations becomes a kind of biological inheritance that shapes the psychological landscape of descendants. This transmission of psychological wounds across generations reveals depression to be not just an individual phenomenon, but a form of collective trauma that accumulates over time. The depression experienced by any individual may reflect not only their personal struggles, but the unresolved suffering of parents, grandparents, and entire lineages stretching back through history. Understanding depression as intergenerational trauma fundamentally alters how we approach both treatment and prevention. Healing individual depression may require addressing not just personal history, but family and cultural patterns that have been transmitted across generations. The depressed individual becomes not just a patient, but a carrier of collective wounds that seek resolution through their suffering. This perspective helps explain why depression often involves such profound feelings of guilt, shame, and existential burden that seem disproportionate to personal circumstances. The depressed individual may be unconsciously carrying psychological material that belongs not just to them, but to entire lineages of ancestors who never had opportunities to process their own trauma and loss. Recent research using advanced genetic analysis has revealed that populations with histories of collective trauma, war, genocide, forced migration, cultural destruction, show higher rates of depression that persist for multiple generations after the original traumatic events. The psychological wounds of historical trauma become embedded in the biology of survivor populations in ways that affect their descendants' mental health decades or even centuries later. This means that contemporary depression cannot be understood apart from historical context and collective memory. An individual's depressive episode may be expressing not just personal difficulties, but the unresolved grief of entire communities that experienced systematic oppression, violence, or cultural destruction. The suffering becomes a form of biological memory that seeks acknowledgement and healing through individual consciousness. These insights point toward forms of treatment that integrate individual healing with historical and cultural awareness. Helping someone recover from depression may require not just addressing their personal psychology, but acknowledging the larger historical forces that have shaped their families' and communities' experience across generations. But such historically informed treatment faces enormous challenges because it requires confronting uncomfortable truths about collective responsibility for historical trauma and its ongoing effects. Many individuals and communities prefer to view depression as purely individual pathology rather than acknowledging how historical injustices continue to generate contemporary suffering through biological and psychological mechanisms. This avoidance of historical responsibility may itself contribute to the persistence of depression across generations. When collective trauma remains unacknowledged and unaddressed, it continues to be transmitted through families and communities in ways that create new forms of suffering while obscuring their historical origins. The implications extend beyond treatment to encompass fundamental questions about social responsibility and collective healing. If depression partly reflects the ongoing effects of historical trauma, then addressing it may require not just individual therapy, but collective acknowledgement of historical injustices and commitment to preventing their repetition. These considerations lead us toward an understanding of depression that encompasses individual, familial, cultural, and historical dimensions in ways that challenge conventional boundaries between personal and political, psychological and social, individual and collective. Depression emerges not as a discrete medical condition, but as a complex phenomenon that reveals fundamental tensions and contradictions within human civilization itself. This multidimensional understanding of depression has profound implications for how we approach both research and treatment. Instead of focusing solely on individual brains and personal histories, we must also examine the cultural, economic, and historical contexts within which depressive suffering emerges. The neural alterations that create individual distress may reflect adaptations to environments that are themselves problematic in ways that healthy human consciousness cannot easily tolerate. Such comprehensive understanding requires forms of knowledge that integrate insights from neuroscience, psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, and even spirituality. The mysteries of depression cannot be solved through any single discipline, but require wisdom that encompasses the full complexity of human existence in all its individual and collective dimensions. This brings us to one of the most challenging aspects of depression's mystery: its relationship to what researchers call meaning-making systems, the frameworks of belief, value, and purpose through which individuals organize their understanding of existence. Depression appears to involve a fundamental breakdown in these meaning-making systems, leaving individuals unable to construct coherent explanations for why their lives matter or what purposes their suffering might serve. Recent neuroimaging studies have revealed that depression specifically affects brain regions involved in what researchers call semantic processing, the neural networks responsible for connecting experiences to larger frameworks of meaning and significance. During depressive episodes, these networks become hyperactive in some areas while shutting down in others, creating forms of meaning-making that become obsessively focused on themes of inadequacy, hopelessness, and meaninglessness. This disruption of meaning-making systems helps explain why depression often involves such profound existential suffering that goes far beyond simple sadness or disappointment. Individuals find themselves unable to construct explanations for their experience that provide comfort, direction, or hope. The frameworks of meaning that previously organized their understanding of life become inadequate to address the intensity and complexity of their suffering. But there is something even more mysterious happening here that touches on fundamental questions about the relationship between consciousness and meaning itself. Some individuals report that depression, while destroying familiar frameworks of meaning, also opened them to forms of understanding that transcended conventional categories of significance and purpose. The breakdown of ordinary meaning-making became a gateway to more profound forms of awareness that could encompass paradox, uncertainty, and mystery in ways that conventional frameworks could not. This suggests that depression may sometimes represent not just the destruction of meaning, but the psyche's attempt to access forms of significance that transcend ordinary human categories. The suffering involved may be the price of consciousness attempting to expand beyond its usual boundaries into territories of awareness that require the dissolution of familiar forms of understanding. Such expansion of consciousness through suffering points toward connections between depression and what various wisdom traditions have called dark nights of the soul, periods of spiritual crisis where familiar forms of meaning and identity dissolve to make way for more profound forms of awareness. The parallels between clinical depression and mystical experience raise profound questions about the relationship between pathology and transformation, between breakdown and breakthrough. These questions become even more complex when we consider recent research on what neuroscientists call altered states of consciousness in depression. Advanced brain imaging has revealed that severe depressive episodes often involve states of neural activity that resemble those found in deep meditation, psychedelic experiences, and other forms of consciousness that transcend ordinary waking awareness. This suggests that depression may sometimes represent not just mental illness, but an involuntary altered state of consciousness that provides access to forms of awareness normally unavailable to ordinary waking mind. The suffering involved may reflect the difficulty of integrating these expanded states of consciousness with the demands of everyday life and social functioning. If this interpretation has validity, then treating depression may require not just restoring normal consciousness, but helping individuals integrate expanded awareness with functional daily existence. The goal becomes not simply eliminating symptoms, but facilitating a form of consciousness that can encompass both ordinary and extraordinary states of awareness without being overwhelmed by either. Such integration requires forms of wisdom that go beyond conventional medical and psychological training to encompass insights from contemplative traditions, consciousness research, and other disciplines that have explored the furthest reaches of human awareness. The mysteries of depression may ultimately require forms of understanding that bridge scientific and spiritual approaches to consciousness in ways that honor both empirical rigor and experiential wisdom. As we approach the deepest territories of depression's mystery, we find ourselves confronting questions that challenge everything we thought we knew about the nature of consciousness, suffering, and human potential. What emerges is not a simple medical condition, but a complex phenomenon that reveals fundamental aspects of what it means to be conscious beings struggling to create meaning and connection in a reality far stranger and more mysterious than our everyday experience suggests. The journey through depression's landscapes may ultimately serve not just individual healing, but the evolution of human consciousness itself, as we learn to navigate forms of awareness that transcend the boundaries of ordinary psychological experience while remaining grounded in the practical requirements of embodied existence. The suffering involved may be the price of consciousness expanding beyond its current limitations into territories of understanding that have the potential to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human development. These profound questions about consciousness expansion through suffering lead us into the most mysterious territory of all, the relationship between depression and what researchers are beginning to call metacognitive awareness. The mind's capacity to observe its own processes with a kind of witnessing consciousness that transcends ordinary self-reflection. During severe depressive episodes, something extraordinary occurs that challenges our basic understanding of how consciousness operates. Individuals often report experiencing what they describe as a split in awareness. Part of them remains trapped in cycles of despair and rumination, while another part seems to watch these processes with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. This witnessing consciousness appears to operate according to different rules than the suffering consciousness, observing without being consumed, analyzing without being drawn into the emotional vortex. Brain imaging studies have revealed that this phenomenon corresponds to actual changes in neural activity patterns. During depression, regions associated with what neuroscientists call metacognitive monitoring show increased activation, even as areas responsible for emotional regulation become severely compromised. It is as if the brain develops an internal observer that becomes more active precisely when other systems are failing, creating a form of consciousness that can witness its own dysfunction with startling clarity. This emergence of witnessing consciousness during psychological crisis raises profound questions about the nature of awareness itself. If part of our mind can observe our own suffering without being destroyed by it, what does this tell us about the fundamental structure of consciousness? Are we dealing with multiple layers of awareness that operate independently? Or is there some deeper form of consciousness that can encompass both suffering and witnessing without being defined by either? The implications become even more intriguing when we consider recent discoveries about what happens to this witnessing consciousness after depressive episodes resolve. Many individuals report that the capacity for metacognitive observation that emerged during their darkest periods persists even after their mood symptoms improve. They describe having developed a kind of internal witness that can observe their thoughts and emotions with greater objectivity and less reactive involvement than was possible before their depressive experience. This persistent enhancement of metacognitive capacity suggests that depression may sometimes catalyze forms of consciousness development that would otherwise remain latent. The same neural processes that create suffering may also strengthen the mind's capacity for self-observation and psychological insight in ways that prove beneficial long after the acute crisis has passed. But there is something even more mysterious happening within this expanded metacognitive landscape. Recent research has revealed that individuals who develop strong witnessing consciousness during depression also show enhanced activity in brain networks associated with what researchers call non-dual awareness, states of consciousness where the normal boundaries between observer and observed, self and world, begin to dissolve. These non-dual states, which have been extensively studied in contemplative traditions but only recently examined by neuroscience, involve a form of awareness that transcends the usual subject-object structure of ordinary consciousness. Instead of experiencing themselves as separate observers, looking at their thoughts and emotions, individuals report states where awareness and its contents merge into a unified field of knowing that encompasses both suffering and peace without being limited by either. The emergence of non-dual awareness during depression challenges our fundamental assumptions about the relationship between pathology and spiritual development. Traditional models assume that psychological health and spiritual insight develop along parallel but separate tracks, with mental illness representing a deviation from healthy spiritual growth. But the neuroscience of depression suggests a more complex relationship, where psychological crisis may sometimes catalyze forms of spiritual awareness that transcend ordinary categories of health and illness. This intersection of clinical depression and non-dual consciousness points toward possibilities for understanding and treating psychological suffering that integrate medical and contemplative approaches in unprecedented ways. Instead of viewing depression solely as pathology to be eliminated, we might also recognize it as a potential gateway to forms of consciousness that encompass both suffering and transcendence without being trapped by either. Such integration requires developing treatment approaches that can work simultaneously with the medical dimensions of depression, the neurobiological dysfunction that creates genuine suffering, and its potential spiritual dimensions. The possibility that this suffering may be catalyzing forms of consciousness development that serve larger purposes in human evolution. Recent pilot studies exploring meditation-based interventions for depression have yielded results that support this integrated approach. Individuals who learn to cultivate witnessing consciousness through contemplative practices show not only reduced depressive symptoms, but also enhanced resilience, increased empathy, and expanded capacity for finding meaning in difficult experiences. The same metacognitive skills that emerge naturally during some depressive episodes can be deliberately cultivated through contemplative training in ways that accelerate healing while preserving the insights that suffering has generated. But these approaches also reveal the delicate balance required when working with consciousness at these depths. The line between transformative spiritual crisis and destructive psychological breakdown remains perilously thin, and interventions that attempt to catalyze consciousness development through suffering risk causing more harm than healing. The witnessing awareness that can emerge during depression is a double-edged sword that can either facilitate profound growth or become another form of psychological prison where individuals become trapped in detached observation of their own pain. This brings us to one of the most challenging aspects of depression's relationship to consciousness development, the phenomenon of what researchers call spiritual bypassing, the tendency to use spiritual concepts and practices to avoid dealing with the practical psychological work that genuine healing requires. Some individuals become so fascinated by the expanded states of consciousness that depression can catalyze that they resist engaging with the medical and therapeutic interventions that might alleviate their suffering. The result is a form of psychological limbo where individuals remain trapped in depressive symptoms while convincing themselves that their suffering serves some higher spiritual purpose. They may develop sophisticated philosophical frameworks for understanding their depression as a form of spiritual initiation, while remaining unable to function effectively in daily life or maintain healthy relationships. This spiritual bypassing reveals the importance of maintaining what contemplative traditions call embodied spirituality, forms of consciousness development that remain grounded in practical engagement with the requirements of incarnate existence. True spiritual insight, according to these traditions, does not transcend the need for psychological health, but includes it as an essential foundation for sustainable spiritual development. The integration of spiritual and medical approaches to depression thus requires maintaining a delicate balance between honoring the transformative potential of psychological crisis while also addressing its genuine pathological dimensions. The goal becomes not choosing between medical and spiritual perspectives, but finding ways to work with both simultaneously in service of complete healing that encompasses body, mind, and spirit. This integration points toward treatment approaches that recognize depression as simultaneously a medical condition requiring neurobiological intervention and a potential catalyst for consciousness development requiring contemplative guidance. Such approaches might combine psychiatric medication to stabilize brain chemistry with meditation training to cultivate witnessing consciousness, psychotherapy to process psychological material with spiritual direction to integrate expanded awareness, and lifestyle interventions to support brain health with contemplative practices to facilitate ongoing consciousness development. Recent research suggests that such integrated approaches may be more effective than purely medical or purely psychological interventions alone. Individuals who receive treatment that addresses both the neurobiological and consciousness dimensions of depression show better outcomes across multiple measures of psychological, spiritual, and social functioning than those who receive more limited forms of intervention. But implementing such integrated approaches faces enormous obstacles within current healthcare systems that tend to fragment treatment along disciplinary boundaries. Mental health professionals trained in medical models may lack knowledge of contemplative approaches, while spiritual teachers may lack understanding of the neurobiological dimensions of psychological suffering. Creating truly integrated treatment requires forms of training and collaboration that transcend traditional professional boundaries. These challenges point toward the need for new forms of professional development that prepare practitioners to work skillfully with both the medical and spiritual dimensions of psychological suffering. Such training would need to integrate knowledge from neuroscience, psychology, contemplative traditions, and other relevant disciplines in ways that honor the complexity of human consciousness while remaining practically applicable in clinical settings. The development of such integrated approaches may represent one of the most significant advances in understanding and treating depression since the discovery of psychoactive medications. By recognizing depression as both pathology and potential catalyst for consciousness development, we open possibilities for healing that address not just symptom reduction, but the full spectrum of human potential that psychological crisis can reveal. This brings us to perhaps the most profound implication of our exploration into depression's mysteries. The possibility that this condition, for all its darkness and suffering, may also represent humanity's growing edge in consciousness development. As we create increasingly complex and challenging environments through technological and social evolution, we may also be catalyzing forms of psychological crisis that, while genuinely painful, also serve the larger purpose of expanding human awareness beyond its current limitations. In this view, the rising rates of depression in developed nations might reflect not just increasing pathology, but also increasing sensitivity to environmental and social conditions that require new forms of consciousness to navigate successfully. The individuals who develop depression may be, in some sense, the canaries in the coal mine of human consciousness evolution. Their suffering signals the need for forms of awareness that can encompass both the challenges and opportunities of our rapidly changing world. Such a perspective does not diminish the reality of depressive suffering or suggest that individuals should endure unnecessary pain for some supposed greater good. Rather, it points toward the possibility that the same sensitivity and depth of awareness that makes some individuals vulnerable to depression may also position them to contribute to humanity's ongoing consciousness development in ways that could benefit future generations. The research we have explored suggests that depression involves neural processes that, while creating genuine dysfunction and suffering, may also enhance certain forms of perception, insight, and awareness that could prove valuable for human evolution. The challenge becomes learning to cultivate these enhanced capacities while minimizing the suffering involved and ensuring that individuals can function effectively in practical life. This evolutionary perspective on depression aligns with observations from various wisdom traditions about the relationship between suffering and consciousness development. Many contemplative systems recognize that psychological crisis often precedes significant spiritual breakthrough, and that the capacity to transform suffering into wisdom represents one of the highest achievements of human consciousness. But these traditions also emphasize that such transformation requires skillful guidance, appropriate preparation, and careful integration to avoid the spiritual bypassing and psychological inflation that can result from premature exposure to expanded states of consciousness. The same neural plasticity that allows depression to catalyze consciousness development also creates vulnerabilities that require wise and compassionate support to navigate successfully. This brings us to a final consideration that encompasses everything we have explored: the recognition that depression, in all its complexity and mystery, ultimately reveals something profound about the nature of human consciousness itself. Through studying this condition, we discover that awareness is far more fluid, creative, and mysterious than our everyday experience suggests. We learn that suffering and insight are intimately connected, that breakdown and breakthrough often occur simultaneously, and that the boundaries between pathology and potential are far more permeable than medical models typically acknowledge. Perhaps most importantly, we discover that consciousness is not a fixed entity, but a dynamic process that continues to evolve throughout life in response to both internal and external challenges. Depression may represent one form of this ongoing evolution, a sometimes necessary, always challenging process through which awareness expands beyond its current limitations into territories of understanding that have the potential to transform not just individual lives, but the entire trajectory of human development. The science of depression thus becomes more than medical research. It becomes a window into the deepest mysteries of consciousness itself, revealing aspects of human potential that remain largely unexplored by conventional psychology and neuroscience. As we continue to unravel these mysteries, we may discover that depression, properly understood and skillfully worked with, represents not just a condition to be treated, but a doorway to forms of awareness that could fundamentally alter our understanding of what it means to be human. This understanding of depression as a potential doorway to expanded consciousness brings us to the threshold of perhaps our most challenging realization, that the very suffering we seek to eliminate may also be the catalyst for forms of awareness that our species desperately needs to develop. Yet this recognition comes with profound responsibility, for we must learn to work with these expanded states without romanticizing the genuine anguish they involve, or abandoning those who cannot find their way through the darkness alone. Recent longitudinal studies following individuals through multiple depressive episodes reveals something that challenges our linear assumptions about recovery and relapse. Rather than viewing recurring depression as treatment failure, researchers are discovering that each episode often involves different neural patterns, different forms of consciousness alteration, and different opportunities for psychological development. It is as if the psyche returns to depressive states, not out of pathology, but out of some deeper imperative to complete unfinished developmental processes. This cyclical nature of depression mirrors patterns found throughout natural systems where apparent setbacks actually serve larger evolutionary purposes. The forest that burns regenerates with greater diversity. The river that floods carves new channels that increase its capacity. The consciousness that descends into depressive darkness may be undergoing a similar process of creative destruction that serves purposes we are only beginning to understand. What emerges from this perspective is a radical reimagining of what constitutes successful treatment. Instead of measuring success solely through symptom elimination and return to previous functioning, we might also consider whether individuals have integrated the insights their suffering generated, whether they have developed greater resilience and wisdom, whether they have accessed forms of awareness that enhance their capacity to navigate future challenges with greater skill and compassion. This expanded definition of recovery recognizes that some forms of psychological suffering may be irreducible aspects of human consciousness development rather than pathologies to be eliminated. The goal becomes not the absence of all psychological pain, but the cultivation of consciousness sophisticated enough to transform suffering into wisdom, breakdown into breakthrough, isolation into deeper connection with the fundamental patterns that govern all existence. Such transformation requires what we might call metabolic consciousness, awareness capable of digesting difficult experiences and converting them into psychological nutrients that nourish ongoing development. This capacity appears to develop naturally in some individuals during depressive episodes, while others require specific training and support to cultivate it effectively. The neuroscience reveals that this metabolic capacity involves enhanced connectivity between brain regions that normally operate in isolation. Areas responsible for emotional processing begin communicating more effectively with regions involved in meaning-making and long-term memory consolidation. The result is consciousness that can extract significance from suffering rather than simply enduring it passively. But there is something even more remarkable happening within this enhanced neural connectivity that points toward possibilities for human consciousness we have barely begun to explore. Advanced brain imaging during states of integrated awareness shows patterns that resemble those found in the most accomplished contemplatives after decades of intensive practice. It is as if depression, under the right conditions, can catalyze in months or years forms of consciousness development that might otherwise require lifetimes to achieve. This acceleration of consciousness development through crisis reflects what systems theorists call punctuated equilibrium, periods of rapid transformation that occur when existing structures become inadequate to handle environmental challenges. Depression may represent consciousness encountering conditions that require immediate evolution rather than gradual adaptation. The implications extend far beyond individual psychology into questions about the future of human consciousness itself. As we create increasingly complex technological and social environments, we may be inadvertently selecting for forms of awareness that can navigate unprecedented challenges. The individuals who develop depression may be the first to encounter these evolutionary pressures, their suffering serving as advanced reconnaissance for consciousness adaptations that our entire species may eventually need to develop. This evolutionary perspective does not diminish individual suffering or suggest that people should endure depression for some supposed greater good. Rather, it points toward the possibility that by understanding and working skillfully with the consciousness changes that depression involves, we might accelerate beneficial adaptations while minimizing unnecessary pain. Such work requires developing what we might call evolutionary compassion, the ability to hold individual suffering with tenderness while simultaneously recognizing its potential contribution to larger patterns of human development. This form of compassion neither minimizes pain nor inflates its significance, but creates space for both healing and growth to occur simultaneously. The cultivation of evolutionary compassion demands integration of perspectives that are rarely brought together. Clinical expertise in treating psychological suffering, contemplative wisdom about consciousness development, evolutionary understanding of how species adapt to environmental challenges, and philosophical insight into the nature of meaning and purpose in human existence. Recent pilot programs attempting such integration have yielded promising results. Individuals receiving treatment that combines medical intervention with contemplative training and evolutionary perspective show not only reduced symptoms, but also enhanced capacity for finding meaning in their experience, greater resilience to future challenges, and increased ability to contribute positively to their communities. But these integrated approaches also reveal the enormous complexity involved in working skillfully with consciousness at these depths. The line between therapeutic intervention and spiritual guidance becomes blurred, requiring practitioners to develop competencies that span multiple disciplines. The risk of spiritual bypassing must be balanced against the equally problematic tendency to pathologize all forms of consciousness that deviate from statistical norms. This complexity points toward the need for entirely new forms of professional training that prepare practitioners to work with both the pathological and transformational dimensions of psychological crisis. Such training would need to integrate neuroscience and contemplative psychology, medical intervention and spiritual guidance, individual healing and collective evolution in ways that honor the full spectrum of human potential while remaining grounded in practical effectiveness. The development of such integrated approaches may represent one of the most significant challenges facing mental health professionals in the coming decades. As our understanding of consciousness deepens and our environmental challenges intensify, we will increasingly encounter forms of psychological suffering that transcend traditional diagnostic categories and require interventions that span multiple domains of human experience. This brings us to a recognition that may be the most important insight emerging from our exploration of depression's mysteries: that the boundaries between medical treatment, psychological therapy, spiritual practice, and consciousness research are artificial divisions that limit our understanding of human potential. Depression reveals these boundaries to be conveniences of professional specialization rather than reflections of how consciousness actually operates. The neural processes involved in depression span biological, psychological, social, and spiritual dimensions simultaneously. The interventions that prove most effective address multiple levels of human experience at once. The outcomes that matter most encompass not just symptom reduction, but enhanced wisdom, resilience, compassion, and capacity for meaningful contribution to the larger patterns of existence. This multidimensional understanding of depression and its treatment points toward forms of healing that recognize human beings as integrated systems operating within larger fields of relationship and meaning. Such healing addresses not just individual dysfunction, but the ways in which individual suffering reflects and contributes to collective patterns of health and pathology. As we conclude our journey through the landscapes of depressed consciousness, we find ourselves not with simple answers, but with profound questions that will likely occupy researchers, clinicians, and individuals for generations to come. What we have discovered is that depression, far from being a straightforward medical condition, represents one of the most complex and mysterious phenomena in human experience. Through studying depression, we have encountered fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, the relationship between suffering and wisdom, the boundaries between pathology and potential, and the evolutionary trajectory of human awareness itself. We have seen how individual neural processes connect to collective cultural patterns, how personal suffering reflects historical trauma, and how psychological breakdown may sometimes catalyze breakthrough into forms of consciousness that transcend ordinary limitations. Perhaps most importantly, we have learned that depression demands from us forms of understanding and intervention that honor the full complexity of human consciousness without being overwhelmed by that complexity. The suffering involved is real and requires skilled medical and psychological intervention. The insights generated are valuable and deserve contemplative exploration. The evolutionary implications are significant and merit serious scientific investigation. The path forward requires what we might call integral wisdom, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously without collapsing them into simplistic reductions. Medical intervention and spiritual practice, neurobiological research and contemplative inquiry, individual healing and collective transformation, all of these approaches contribute essential insights that become most powerful when integrated rather than pursued in isolation. Such integration challenges us to develop new forms of professional collaboration, new models of treatment delivery, and new ways of understanding the relationship between individual well-being and collective flourishing. It demands from practitioners willingness to work beyond the boundaries of their training, from researchers openness to phenomena that transcend their methodologies, and from individuals courage to engage with their suffering as both challenge and opportunity. The science of depression ultimately reveals depression to be not just a disorder of individual brains, but a phenomenon that illuminates the deepest mysteries of consciousness itself. Through understanding how awareness can be disrupted, fragmented, and reconstituted, we gain insights into the nature of human consciousness that extend far beyond clinical applications into fundamental questions about what it means to be conscious beings, navigating existence in all its beauty and terror. The ultimate revelation that emerges from our descent into these territories is perhaps the most unsettling of all, that what we call normal consciousness, the everyday awareness through which most humans navigate their lives, may itself be a form of collective amnesia. Depression strips away this amnesia with brutal efficiency, revealing aspects of existence that our ordinary mind works tirelessly to obscure. Consider this final paradox that researchers are beginning to acknowledge. The very mechanisms that protect us from depression may also be the mechanisms that prevent us from accessing deeper truths about the nature of reality itself. The cognitive filters that maintain psychological stability, the neurochemical processes that generate optimism and motivation, the social conventions that provide meaning and belonging, all of these may function as elaborate defense systems against forms of awareness that consciousness is not yet equipped to integrate. Depression dismantles these defense systems one by one, leaving individuals exposed to raw experience in ways that feel overwhelming and often unbearable. Yet within this exposure lies something that mystics and philosophers have pointed toward for millennia: direct contact with the fundamental uncertainty, impermanence, and interconnectedness that characterize existence at its deepest levels. The depressed individual who reports feeling like everything is meaningless may be encountering the authentic groundlessness that underlies all constructed meaning. The person who experiences themselves as dissolving into nothingness may be touching the fundamental emptiness from which all form emerges. The consciousness that feels fragmented and alien may be glimpsing the multiplicity that normal awareness weaves into the illusion of unified selfhood. This suggests that depression, in its most profound manifestations, may represent not deviation from normal consciousness, but temporary glimpses of what consciousness becomes when it is no longer constrained by the elaborate psychological and neurobiological structures that maintain ordinary human experience. The suffering involved stems not from the glimpses themselves, but from the lack of context and support for integrating such expanded awareness into functional existence. Recent studies of individuals who have successfully navigated severe depression reveal that many develop what researchers call post-conventional consciousness, forms of awareness that can hold paradox, uncertainty, and multiplicity without collapsing into fragmentation or chaos. These individuals report that their depressive experiences, while genuinely traumatic, also open doorways to forms of understanding and compassion that remain permanently accessible even after acute symptoms resolve. They describe developing tolerance for emotional complexity that allows them to feel multiple contradictory emotions simultaneously without being overwhelmed. They report enhanced capacity to hold suffering, both their own and others, without immediately moving to fix or escape it. Most significantly, they often describe a fundamental shift in their relationship to identity itself, moving from identification with a fixed self to recognition of awareness as a fluid, dynamic process. These shifts in consciousness align remarkably with descriptions found in contemplative traditions of what emerges through sustained engagement with the deepest aspects of human experience. The difference lies not in the territory accessed, but in the means of access. Contemplative practitioners typically develop these capacities through gradual supported practice over many years, while depression can catalyze similar developments through crisis that unfolds over months or weeks. This parallel suggests possibilities for understanding depression not as pathology requiring elimination, but as involuntary initiation into expanded forms of consciousness that require skilled guidance to navigate successfully. The goal becomes not preventing or quickly resolving all depressive episodes, but developing collective wisdom about how to support individuals through these initiatory processes in ways that maximize growth while minimizing unnecessary suffering. Such support would require fundamental changes in how we approach mental health treatment, moving from models focused primarily on symptom reduction toward approaches that can work simultaneously with pathology and potential. It would demand integration of medical intervention with contemplative guidance, psychological therapy with spiritual wisdom, individual treatment with community support. Most importantly, it would require recognizing that some forms of human suffering may be irreducible aspects of consciousness development rather than problems to be solved. The challenge becomes learning to distinguish between suffering that serves evolutionary purposes and suffering that simply destroys, between crisis that catalyzes growth and crisis that leads only to disintegration. This distinction cannot be made through abstract principles, but emerges only through careful attention to the unique circumstances of each individual's experience. Some depressions may indeed represent involuntary spiritual initiations requiring contemplative support. Others may reflect purely neurobiological dysfunction requiring medical intervention. Most likely involve complex interactions between multiple levels that require integrated approaches tailored to specific needs. The development of such nuanced understanding represents one of the great challenges facing humanity as we navigate increasingly complex technological and social environments that place unprecedented demands on human consciousness. The individuals experiencing depression today may be the first to encounter evolutionary pressures that our entire species will eventually need to address. Their suffering serves as both warning and opportunity. Warning about the psychological costs of certain forms of modern life and opportunity to develop new capacities for navigating complexity, uncertainty, and change. The insights emerging from their struggle may prove essential for collective survival and flourishing in an increasingly uncertain world. This brings us to our final recognition that understanding depression ultimately requires understanding consciousness itself in all its mystery and potential. We have journeyed through territories where neuroscience meets philosophy, where individual suffering reveals collective patterns, where breakdown and breakthrough dance together in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew about human nature. What we have discovered is not a simple condition with clear causes and straightforward treatments, but a phenomenon that illuminates the very foundations of what it means to be conscious beings, struggling to create meaning and connection in a reality far stranger and more complex than our everyday experience suggests. Depression becomes a doorway into the deepest mysteries of human existence, demanding from us forms of understanding and response that honor both the suffering involved and the profound insights it may generate. The path forward requires courage to face the depths of human experience without flinching, wisdom to work skillfully with consciousness in all its complexity, and compassion that can hold both individual pain and collective transformation. As we continue to explore these territories, we may discover that depression, properly understood and skillfully engaged, represents not just a condition to be treated, but a crucial dimension of human consciousness evolution itself.